Hey guys, happy Monday. Welcome back to MDWZ. Flip over in your Bibles to Acts chapter 9. That's where we're going to be today. This verse is kind of common, this chapter, is kind of commonplace. We've probably read it a lot before, but I kind of want to dissect it and look at it from a new perspective today. So we're going to be in verses 1 through 17. Basically, I'm going to give a little bit of a summary and then read a few verses and kind of go from there. So as it starts out, we're picking up after Jesus has ascended back into heaven. We're in the first few chapters of Acts, which is basically describing the early church and how it operated after Jesus ascended back into heaven and left the Holy Spirit with his disciples. And this is basically the establishment of the church, even as we still see it today. So as we see the church is growing and it's expanding and it's increasing so much that it's starting to become a threat to the traditional Jewish believers, to which this guy Saul is one of them. Later, Saul's name gets changed to Paul, so if I use that a little bit interchangeably, please forgive me. It just gets a little confusing. But essentially what's happening is Saul is seeing these new Christians as a threat, and he's seeing them as a big threat specifically to his religion and the spreading of his religion. So his solution to this is he's going to round them up and he's going to kill them. And he's on the way to Damascus so that he can get this approved by the governor, and so that he can basically move forward with that and not face any legal repercussions. So basically the first verse says that Saul is still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He went to the high priest and requested letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if any man or woman be found belonging to the way, he might bring them as prisoners to Jerusalem. And there from Jerusalem they're planning on killing these prisoners. So in verse 4 it says, falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Essentially what happened was Jesus came to him in a bright light and a big flash and a big vision and knocked him off his horse. And all of a sudden, Saul is having this vision of the Lord, of Jesus Christ. And that's really important for later in the New Testament, because when people want to bring up and they want to discuss and debate whether or not Paul is actually an apostle, one of the qualifications to be an apostle was meeting Jesus. So Paul did have an encounter with Jesus at this point. And it says, who are you, Lord? Saul said, I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting, he replied. But get up, go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. So the men traveling with Saul at this point hear the voice and know that there's some kind of commotion, but they don't see what's going on, which again is important because it distinguishes Paul as an apostle. It says, Saul got up and went, even though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. They led him by the hand into Damascus. He was unable to see for 3 days, and he did not eat or drink. So later on in verse 10, the Lord comes to a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. And he says, Ananias, and he says, here am I, Lord, he replied. He says, get up and go to the street called Straight, the Lord said to him, to the house of Judas, and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, since he is praying there. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias coming and placing his hands on him so he can regain his sight. Lord, answered Ananias, I have heard from many people about this man, and how he has done harm to your saints in Jerusalem, and how he has come here to get authority from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, go, for this man is my chosen instrument to the Gentiles, the kings, and the Israelites. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. And then Ananias goes, he meets up with Paul. They pray. Paul goes outside and he's baptized in the name of the Lord, and he becomes Paul. He changes his name, he goes about his business, and ultimately he ends up writing 13 or 14 of the 26 books of the New Testament. So basically what you see Saul's conversion into Paul is what we're looking at here. So the first thing I want to take away from this, a lot of times we look at this from the perspective of Paul, but I think it's really important to consider Ananias' perspective as well. And we're going to get into him in just a little bit, but the first thing I want to talk about today is God does not care about your past. So that's the first thing that a lot of people, when they're converting, they're afraid that they can't become a Christian because of the things that they've done before. And when you look at that from the perspective of the Apostle Paul, and from the person who wrote 13 of the 26 books of the New Testament, check your past and look at what you've done. I don't think it's as bad as trying to legalize the murder of Christians. I don't know that necessarily, but I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say that. So if God can use this guy Paul in a mighty way, he can use you in a mighty way too. And that excuse doesn't really fly when you're talking about, your past and people won't listen to you and things like that. Because I always tell my youth that if you are going through a certain situation, maybe God is putting you through that situation so that when you get out of it clean, you can be a light to people who are going through the same thing. You know, a lot of times you get asked, why does God allow good things to go, good people to go through bad things? And you look at what happened to the Apostle Paul, and God said to Ananias, I'm going to show Paul how much he's going to have to suffer to be my disciple. And you look at Paul later, and he goes through prison, he goes through loneliness, he goes through having a thorn in his side, which the Bible's not super specific about. But he goes through all these things, and he suffers for Jesus Christ's name, and ultimately he comes out a better man and a better Christian. And at the end, he's faced with this choice of, do I want to live and keep being a missionary, or do I want to die and be with Jesus? And he says, look, dying would be easier at this point because I get to go home and I get to be with Jesus. But living is where my purpose is, and it's where I get to become, where I get to worship and to minister and to help people. So Paul, you know, unselfishly decides, you know, that I'm going to keep on fighting and I'm going to keep on living for Jesus. And all of that comes from a guy who, again, was trying to legalize the arresting and the murdering of people just because they were Christians. So God does not care about your past. Number two, Jesus will meet you where you are. I think that's so important and so impressive because a lot of times we think about salvation and we think we have to have this big, extravagant salvation process and we got to have a story and we got to have a testimony. Jesus met Paul on that road where he was. And when you think about what it means to become a Christian and what it means to encounter God for the first time, what it means to encounter Jesus, it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're on the Damascus Road, if you are at a mega church, if you're in the woods, if you're at a church camp, it does not matter. Jesus will literally meet you where you are. And that's one of the perks, I should say, of Christianity, is that you don't have to get all dolled up and to go to the temple and to go into the holiest of holies and tie a rope around your waist and just pray to God that he accepts you and that you don't fall over dead so that they can drag you out with that rope. That's the beauty of Christianity, and that's the beauty of having a relationship with Jesus, is not only does that initial meeting happen where you need it to happen, but every other meeting up until that point does too. And we talk about it being a relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's to say that we can reach out and we can be with him and we can speak with him and we can read our Bibles and we can say what's on our minds wherever we are, and Jesus will meet us there. You know, in the Bible it talks about where 2 or 3 or more are gathered, I am in the midst of them also. And I think that's beautiful because should you go to church? Absolutely yes. You don't want to forsake the gathering of believers and everything like that. But you can meet Jesus and you can worship Jesus wherever you are. And I think that's the beauty of Christianity. And the last point I want to take away today, are you willing to be an Ananias? And I pause on that and I'm letting it linger for a little bit because I really want you to think about that. Think about that person that when their name gets brought up, you immediately shudder and you don't want to talk about, right? That was Saul to Ananias, right? He had heard nothing but bad things about this guy. This guy was basically the Jewish boogeyman, right? He would go and he would round up Christians and he would take them away to Damascus or Jerusalem or wherever and he would have them killed. And basically, this was the dude that you would tell your children stories about. And all of a sudden, God goes to Ananias and he says, I want you to minister to this guy. Not only do I want you to minister to this guy, I want you to baptize him, I want you to heal him, and I want you to look at him and I want you to hear what he has to say, because he's going to be the new leader of my church. And ultimately, he's going to write 13 of the 26 New Testament books. And I want you to be prepared because you're going to have to listen to this guy. And what does Ananias do? He questions it at first. He says, God, this guy is bad news. And then God says, yeah, but I want you to minister to him anyway. And I think about Ananias, and I think about it from the perspective of us and where we are as Christians. And if God called us to minister to our worst enemy, what would our reaction be? And I really want you guys to marinate on that this week when you're going through your daily life. And when you see that person that just kind of makes you shudder, what if God's calling you to minister to them? Are we going to be willing to step up to the plate like Ananias, or are we not? And guys, I want that to be your challenge this week. I want, whenever you think about what God might be calling you to do, don't put it off. Just step out and go out on a limb and just do it and see what happens. So, see you guys next week. Again, happy Monday.